I'm Rachel Riley, and you're listening to the Power of Us podcast, brought to you by Legal & General. In today's episode, we're looking at perhaps our biggest challenge, tackling climate change and working together for a truly sustainable future. Our keen and interested and informed panel today consists of Gwen Buck, Policy Advisor from Green Alliance. Hi, Gwen.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. We are also joined by Emerson Sutton, 13-year-old young advisor to the young Mayor of Lewisham. Welcome, Emerson.
Hello.
And last but not least, we have John Bromley, Head of Clean Energy from Legal & General. Hi, John.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here.
So that's our trio. And today we're discussing global warming, climate change and greener futures. So the big question, the hot question, unfortunately, is how do we get sustainability to the top of the agenda? I'll start with you, Gwen.
I think it's a really good time to be asking questions like this. We've actually just heard results from the UK's first Citizens' Assembly on climate change, Climate Assembly UK. And so this was 105 members of the public who came together, sort of selected at random to represent the whole of the UK. And it was really interesting because the top three recommendations that they had, first was informing and educating everyone. And secondly was fairness in the UK, so supporting the most vulnerable. And thirdly was leadership from the government. So people really want to see leadership there.
Emerson, the first recommendation that the board put forward was educating the public. I mean, you're still in education, age 13. Do you think we need more awareness raising still?
What I personally believe is that we always need to educate ourselves. We always need to be able to understand what's going on because nothing stands still. I think it's the people in power that really need to be able to understand because they're making, let's just say, they're not making the best choices based on facts and based on information.
So you don't necessarily trust the government making these decisions. What kind of sources do you trust to get the real information on climate change?
Right now, it would probably be the newspaper or Twitter because it's a quite challenging time for the government. Obviously, they have a pandemic on their hands and that's tough for any government to be able to handle. I can't really trust them in terms of situations like climate change. So if the newspapers say something that everyone is saying, then yeah, I would trust it. And just Twitter, because it's something that is so vast and so wide that if something does get put forward and everyone agrees with it, then it's most likely going to be true.
Twitter's kind of our bubble, so it's who we choose to follow. So do you follow the type of people that are putting information out there about climate change? Are you passionate about it?
Yes, as we've already seen, COVID-19 has impacted the generations in school right now. And if we don't act with climate change, the exact same thing's going to happen. So I don't think I actually need to be able to follow certain people because as I already seen yesterday, I think it was, Greta Thunberg was talking about climate change and it's everywhere.
So social media is really helping it get to the top of the agenda for you. But for the government, there are probably more pressing things like COVID to deal with at the moment.
I think very eloquently, Emerson's putting the point around the government's challenges with COVID and climate change coming at a similar time. I was concerned that it's often the most vulnerable people in our society. They don't just suffer from the way that we've been managing the planet and exploiting some of those natural resources. In the actual initial exploitation of those resources, that is quite often affecting certain communities, and particularly sort of poorer communities, disproportionately.
When you say our community, do you mean globally?
Globally, yes. It's those same communities that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change when they happen. They're starting to show us how the environment, from which we think our mistreatment and kind of our sort of impact on the environment might have even contributed to the origins of COVID-19 in particular. But we're starting to see in our day-to-day lives increasingly how these links and impacts that they go between all of the different areas. They impact on our society, people's opportunities, and equality and equity in our society. And in my role as an investor, trying to manage investments and how we run our financial system. But there's also huge opportunity to change the way we invest in some of these new technologies. And I think there's a real hope. We can't sort of repeat some of those mistakes of the past that continue to leave certain communities and groups in our society behind.
I think if you ask the average member of the public what they think when they think of climate change, they're probably thinking of polar bears, ice caps, deforestation, the first thing that comes to mind probably isn't inequality in the most vulnerable communities. So do you think that should be higher up on the agenda to get more people engaged in the topic?
Yeah, I absolutely think it should. But in the midst of the lockdown, the national concern around COVID and its impacts, we began to realise that some people in our communities were much more vulnerable and much more at risk. So I think we've had an exercise, if you like, in that through COVID, starting with a virus, trying to understand what it means to each individual. And I think that's a really important conversation that we've had around COVID that we possibly haven't had enough around climate change.
Emerson, you're a young advisor to the young mayor of Lewisham. Obviously, you're not surrounded by rainforest, you're not surrounded by ocean ice caps. Are you naturally thinking about the impacts, or is there a bit of a disconnect for being in the city?
Right now, I wouldn't say that many children are aware of it. But for example, something that's little that you can do is you could walk to school rather than take a car or take a bus. You know, those small little things that really help. That's the little things that we need to really be teaching the world. And we really need to think that, hold on, why do I need to get this if I can just walk and it only takes 20 minutes, and rather than wait in traffic and wasting energy that could possibly harm the environment.
So if all of us made small changes, incrementally it would add up.
Yes.
Which is brilliant. I'm glad that it's on your agenda. But Gwen, how do we know when there's so many things that we could do? We can walk instead of driving, but what ideas are just scratching the surface, and what's actually going to make a big change to the globe?
Yeah, it's a good question, because though I obviously think that individual responsibility is really important, we've also got to remember that some people are more responsible than others. So, for instance, 70% of global emissions are caused by 100 companies in the world. So, we really do need to make sure that this leadership is coming from the top as well. And we need to remember that even though we want to live sustainably, we actually live in a society which makes it very hard to do so. So, you see people trying to give up plastic, but if you go to a supermarket, it's incredibly hard to live without plastic because of the way that the economy currently works. So I think it's really important to, make sure that we're not beating ourselves up about not being, a perfect eco-angel. One of the things that John mentioned about communities really made me think one of the biggest emitters of carbon in the UK is actually from the way that we heat our homes, our gas boilers. But actually, if we were able to massively skill up a workforce to be able to go and insulate homes, that's actually a really nice future to look forward to.
Do you think people still believe it's a choice between the economy or the environment?
Something really interesting that's happening at the moment is that the government's treasury, they've actually commissioned this research. It's called the Dasgupta Review. And basically what it shows is that the environment actually underpins the whole economy.
So, John, if we know biodiversity has such a huge impact on the economy, what can we do to make sure it's a top priority?
It is already much higher on the government's agenda than it has been in the past. Seeing plastic bottles floating in the Arctic, there's been a couple of sort of moments that have really hit home for various different reasons. I think that public engagement is a massive driver of politics, obviously. That statistic is really compelling around 70% of the emissions from 100 companies. So we should certainly not shy away from the fact that businesses and investors should not be waiting always for a government plan or policy to change.
That's a staggering statistic that 100 companies are responsible for over 70% of global carbon emissions. I don't know about you, Emerson, but I didn't know that. And it certainly puts it into perspective what we're doing as individuals.
I take that statistic, to be honest, because everyone that I know of is making an effort to not use as much plastic bottles, not do as much to harm the environment. Yet selfish businesses that are at the top of the pyramid, they're thinking about only themselves. What they do is they seem like they are taking interest, but really they aren't. And I think it will show later down the line, and we realise it was those 100 businesses at the top of the table. They seemed like they were doing such good things, but clearly they weren't.
How important do you think the media or social media has a role to play in exposing these bad practices?
They have a massive job, because even the slightest thing from an influencer, whether that's, the Queen to a footballer, it will get magnified. It's making it fashionable. for everyone. I mean by making it appeal to them, because I can guarantee you, if we take a very large business, for example, and we told them, if you don't do this, then your business is going to crumble, I guarantee you they will be able to act on it.
Combination of solutions there. I mean, we've got faming and we've got shaming, and you mentioned influencers. So I think, one of the prime examples recently has been Marcus Rashford, what he's done for child food poverty. Do you think we need similar celebrities to get behind the climate change problem?
Yeah, and I think Marcus Rashford, he's done something that's very clever. He's tackled child poverty and something about food, and he's using his status to be able to tackle them. So I think it's just about showing what is possible and showing what we want to achieve.
That's a fantastic example, Marcus Rashford. But when we're talking about climate and greener initiatives, the climate and issues around global warming are so big that it's actually hard to feel like we're making an impact.
Yeah, you're right. It is just so big and all consuming. And I think what's great is we can sort of like have a little climate change history lesson of what we've achieved so far. What the UK has done, which has been really impressive and actually is a bit of a world leader, is that we've essentially eliminated coal from our economy. Back 20 years ago, coal would have been a huge part of making energy in the UK, whereas now we have a much more diverse mix of energy. And so actually, now we need to look at what are the next big things. There would be things like transport, things like housing, things like agriculture. These are all areas that produce a lot of carbon emissions. And then there are some trickier ones. So there's things about switching to a more sort of flexible diet, which includes more sort of fruit and vegetables and less meat.
You mentioned there changing your diet, because obviously raising livestock is one of the biggest emitters. So given the government introduced a sugar tax when it was deemed by everyone to be bad for our health, John, do you think the government should be looking at products that are more harmful to the environment and possibly putting a taxation on them and giving benefits to greener products?
Yeah, I think I'd take it more broadly and say, do we need some sort of intervention? It could be by tax, or it could be sort of an additional levy for the consumer. Many consumers will not really have a genuine choice. Even if they wanted to make it, they will be buying the cheaper product because they can't afford to pay the more expensive product. So I wouldn't specifically focus on tax, but I would agree that there might well have to be government or regulatory sort of levers, if you like. And really at the heart of all of this is we need to find ways to place an actual value. This is the way our world works. Things that get a monetary value attached to them, that actually does help us to decide what is the best way that we're going to use resources. And this is kind of putting a cost on the damage that something does.
And is that something you think that companies or consumers should bear the brunt of? This
is a huge challenge, because the way in which we would make some of those adjustments, that could sort of contradict some of the things we talked about earlier about, how do we make sure that this is an inclusive move? We've talked a little bit here about how could we reduce the carbon emissions from our homes in the UK. Very, very simplistically, you could put much, much more tax on the sort of fossil fuel way of heating your home through gas. But actually, many, many people, what other option and what choice would they have? Because I think the risk is that actually many people would feel sort of angry and disenfranchised. And I think that's what good businesses that are trying to lead the way on this, they tend to be the ones that don't just think about the consumer or the customer they're serving. They're starting to think about all of the other communities and people. And that's the challenge of a simple notion of we can just sort of tax bad things. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying that we need to be very careful in its application.
Interesting. So you place a lot more weight in businesses actually regulating themselves than any government intervention.
It's more, I'm really concerned that if we always expect and anticipate on government regulation to come, that opens up a big reason and excuse why some people won't act. And we could be having this same conversation in 2025. The Committee on Climate Change showed in their report when they first talked about net zero by 2050, how you could use the technologies we already know about and get to that net zero position by 2050. My guess is that when they launched that report, they were quite concerned that people would say, no way, it's totally unrealistic, 2050 is crazy. And already in the last 12 months, I think there's a real motivation to do it at least by 2050.
And I'll ask Emerson, obviously we've just come out of lockdown. We're potentially facing another one, who knows, but we've got restrictions on our lives. So we've completely changed the way we've lived overnight. How do you think we can translate? How much of a change do you think we need to make to our lives to tackle climate issues? And how much of a hit are you willing to take personally?
With COVID-19, it was a very stressful time, no time to socialise. And I think that although, yes, it was very hard hitting on not only our economy, but our personal lives, I feel if something to that magnitude was shown by greener futures, then it really would impact the whole world and everyone would have a wake-up call of saying, okay, we've had a first lockdown, let's not have a second. And with the greener futures and sustainability, it would be, okay, we've had our first, let's not have a second. It would just need to be depending on how it's done.
I'll ask Gwen, we've mentioned COVID, but also we've got Brexit to sort out. So how do we make sure that the solutions that we find to fix some of the problems coming from Brexit and COVID-19 are also sustainable and they consider green issues at their hearts?
Something that Emerson said before as well about plastics and making sure that the UK is resilient. And I think that your question around sort of Brexit and COVID really highlights the need for real resilient supply chains. And we've talked a little bit about what we can do as individuals. And I just personally think that plastic should really be a no-brainer. And obviously we should be recycling. But actually, resource use goes so much deeper than that. And really, we should be looking at creating a circular economy to make sure that we've got a really resilient economy, and the products that are designed that we're actually able to reuse them much more. We've done a bit of research at Green Alliance and we worked out that if you have a really full circular economy, it could actually add 10 billion a year to profits to the bottom line of UK manufacturing firms. And it also has job implications as well. So 2 jobs in recycling for every 0.1 job in landfill or incineration. Well,
that was an incredibly fruitful debate. We've established that we need some positivity around this, and we've heard the benefits of a sustainable economy from the numbers, the finances. We've established that the individual alone won't be able to solve the crisis, but educating and informing the masses will lead to more engagement and will put pressure on the people who can make decisions, the people in leadership within and without government, who will start to focus on the changes that we all ask them to make. Thank you for joining us, Emerson, Gwen and John. In next week's episode, we'll be rethinking retirement. How can we make later life as fulfilling as possible for all of us? Do join us then. You've been listening to the Power of Us podcast, hosted by me, Rachel Riley, and brought to you by Legal & General.